In the beginning, it was just a delay. A silly mistake, maybe. They must be dealing with some emergency, I thought, while the hem of my dress brushed against my ankle and the makeup on my face started to melt under the afternoon sun. But the hours dragged on. That bus stop, which was supposed to be just a brief pause before the celebration, turned into the stage for the biggest revelation of my life. I had never truly been invited. It wasn't an error. It was a choice. And the worst part? My story didn't start there. That lonely wait was only the final chapter of a book I had refused to read for decades, the book of my own exclusion. A book written in silences, in the just family whispered at church doors, in photos where I had been carefully erased. A whole lifetime where love always came with bills, demands, and silence as the only answer. If you've ever felt invisible even after giving your all to someone, if you've ever caught yourself wondering why you love so much those who hardly see you, this story is for you. Because there comes a moment, painful, but liberating, when you finally decide to stop chasing. And you begin to walk inward. With dignity. With autonomy. With the courage to rewrite your own will, both literal and emotional. Maybe this story is yours. Or your mother's. Or someone else's you still have time to truly see. Either way, get ready, this isn't just a confession. It's a manifesto. A spring that blooms after the longest autumn of a lifetime. If this story touched you in any way, go ahead and subscribe to this channel. There's much more content like this, stories that aren't just stories, but mirrors. The phrase was said without even lifting her eyes, it's just for family. For words, cold as the shadow of the locked gate where I stood, clutching a gift that would never be delivered. The dress I had chosen so carefully. The perfume she always said she loved. The new shoes that pinched my calloused feet, but felt worth it for the occasion. Suddenly, all of it became excess. Superfluous. Just family. The words stuck to my skin like a velvet-gloved slap. For years, I had heard that same phrase in different settings. Gatherings, photos, decisions. There was always an invisible boundary around what counted as real family. And me, what was I? There was no anger at that gate, only exhaustion. A weariness built up over years of trying to fit where I was never wanted. And yet, I still went. Because love is blind, deaf, and stubborn. But that day, love grew tired. Tired of being mistaken for servitude. Tired of paying the price with the empty promise that one day I would finally be seen. My dress wrinkled against the hard cement bench. The minutes dragged like broken promises. An old woman at a bus stop, waiting for a ride to a wedding where she never had a seat. It sounds like fiction. But it's not. It's my reality. And the reality of so many others. Have you ever felt like your very presence was uncomfortable, even in silence? Have you noticed how some doors close politely, but never warmly? How silence answers your messages? How sorry, I forgot replaces thank you for everything? There's an invisible line between being useful and being loved. And for too long, I confused the two. My daughter's wedding was the breaking point. Not because I wasn't picked up, but because in that moment I realized I had never been taken into account. I was just family when it was convenient. Just family when they needed help. Until then, I had said yes to everything. But the cruelest part of exclusion isn't the physical absence, it's the feeling of being ignored at the very core. Like my entire life had been pruned from the family tree and tossed away. Like all my sacrifices were footnotes, never headlines. Being left at that bus stop was symbolic. A ritual of passage. That was the day I stopped being the dedicated mother and became the forgotten old lady. But it was also the beginning of something I didn't yet know how to name: autonomy. Because sometimes, the pain of exclusion is exactly what pushes us back to the center of our own lives. It's not rebellion. It's emotional survival. As I waited, scenes from my life began to replay in my mind. Her birth, her first day at school, her first job. The sleepless nights I spent sewing costumes for school plays. The bills I paid with my cafeteria worker's salary. The parties where I was the server, never the guest. All of it danced through my memory as cars passed and the sun slowly dipped below the horizon. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't call anyone. And that was the biggest shift. For the very first time, I didn't try to justify the unjustifiable. For the first time, I didn't chase after them. And that silent decision marked the beginning of my rebirth at 77, when no one thought I could ever change. That bus stop turned into a living metaphor. It was as if life itself whispered, you don't have to keep waiting. You can move on. And I did. Not physically, I stayed there until nightfall, but something inside me shifted. For the first time, I began counting the moments when I had been just someone else. And in that emotional accounting, I realized the balance had been negative for a very long time. Because when love is measured honestly, the numbers can be terrifying. Giving everything, yet not even receiving presents in return, that is emotional bankruptcy. And no one should live in permanent debt to people who claim to love them. I stayed until the very last bus passed by. Not because I believed anyone would show up, but because I needed to recognize the ending. Like waiting for the last train before the station closes down. No messages, no calls. My phone was silent. The street was empty. And yet, it turned into one of the most revealing moments of my entire life. Because for the very first time, I realized that being alone doesn't always mean loneliness. Sometimes, it means liberation. What hurts isn't solitude itself, it's waiting for someone who never considered you a priority. But when the waiting finally ends, something new begins. Even if it's just a different kind of breath filling your chest. That day, a single phrase became a symbol, just family. The very words meant to exclude me ended up connecting me to an entire circle of women who have awakened. Women who, even late in life, finally understand they deserve more than crumbs. That love should never come with conditions, or with a badge granting limited access. In the pain of abandonment, I discovered the seed of a new story. Because if even your own family can erase you, then you also have the power to rewrite your own last name. This isn't about revenge. It's about visibility. It's about remembering we weren't born to be extras in someone else's biography. At first, it was just little things. A forgotten invitation that must have gotten lost. A message replied to days later with a cold emoji. A birthday that passed without a single greeting. Small details, it seemed. The kind of things you try not to take personally. She's busy. She has kids now. I don't want to sound like a needy mother. I would tell myself those things over and over. But there comes a subtle and devastating moment when forgetfulness stops being an accident. It becomes a choice. And that choice hurts more than any shouted insult. Because when someone forgets you consistently, what they're really doing is erasing you carefully. And that's when it hit me, this wasn't distraction. This was exclusion. And that changes everything. You learn to read the signs. The absence of an invitation. The silence in the family group chat. The sideways glances that never include you in the conversation. It was no longer about being busy. It was about no longer belonging. And there's something cruel in that. It's like still being physically present, but emotionally removed long before. Like a ghost lingering in a place where you once felt alive. And the hardest part? This kind of exclusion wears a mask of normalcy. You don't notice it until you're already standing outside the circle. For years, I kept lying to myself. I told myself it was all in my head. That things would eventually change. That mothers are naturally forgotten once their children grow up. But that wasn't it. It was deeper. It was the discomfort I caused simply by continuing to exist as a presence. It was the unspoken rule that I only had value when I was silent, available, submissive. It was a kind of affection that came with a ruler measured, evaluated, and granted only if I fit the standards. And when I didn't, I was cut out with the subtlety of an invitation never sent and the brutality of a calculated silence. There comes a moment when exclusion becomes undeniable. For me, it arrived days after the wedding. I asked, my voice still trembling, why they hadn't picked me up. The answer? A single heart emoji. Nothing else. No explanation. No remorse. No justification. An emoji. As if my pain could be reduced to a symbol. As if I had been asking too much simply for wanting to be there. And that's when the truth lands. When someone treats your exclusion as normal, it's because it has already been their routine for a long time. You just didn't want to see it before. Because love also means denying the obvious. In that transition from forgotten to excluded, you lose something precious: illusion. And illusion is something you miss, even when it hurts. Because as painful as it is, illusion still comforts you. It gives you excuses to keep trying, to keep loving, to keep giving. But when you finally see that the empty chair at the table was deliberate, when you realize that the gift you bought was never meant to be opened, then love transforms into something else. It becomes exhaustion. Emotional burnout. The math no longer adds up. And you find yourself asking, when did this get so out of control? When did I stop being seen? What frightens me most about this silent exclusion is that no one else notices. To the outside world, everything looks fine. You still appear in old photos. Your name comes up in neutral conversations. But you are no longer alive in the real dynamic. People talk about you, but not to you. You hear stories you should be part of, but you've already been erased from the script. It's like watching your own life from the audience, powerless to step back on stage. And it hurts. Because behind every absence, there's a decision. And behind every decision, someone chose not to include you. Forgetfulness became a tool. Exclusion became routine. And at that point, you begin to question yourself: what did I do wrong? Was I too invasive? Did I ask for too much? Did I love the wrong way? And then, in a brief moment of clarity, you realize love was never the problem. The problem was never setting boundaries. The problem was giving everything without demanding respect in return. The problem was accepting too little in exchange for too much. By normalizing being placed last, exclusion became protocol. Until one day, like in my case, it can no longer be ignored. You find yourself alone, not by choice, but by decree. A silent decree. Devastating nonetheless. At that moment, you have two choices: keep begging for a seat at the table, or finally claim your own. And it's not easy. Because alongside exclusion comes guilt, fear, sadness. But something else comes too. Something small at first, almost shy: the urge to prioritize yourself. To remember who you were before you became only someone's mom. Before you were reduced to a provider of emotional labor. Exclusion hurts. But it also reveals. And what it revealed in me at that bus stop was that I was still alive. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop waiting and start choosing. For me. When I opened the online album, my hands trembled. It felt like flipping through a carefully curated dossier of exclusion. Each photo, each caption, each angle screamed what no one had dared to say out loud: I was never part of that story. There hadn't been a mistake in planning, no misunderstanding. The images proved what the silence had been signaling for years. Just family, read the caption under the photo of everyone at the altar. Everyone but me. And there it was, the confirmation my heart had refused to accept. The erasure had been intentional. The wedding wasn't the breaking point. It was the conclusion of a decision made long ago. The pain wasn't only in my absence. It was in the precision with which they cut me out. One less chair at the reception. A thank you, Mom, directed at someone else. A video montage that began with my daughter's birth but conveniently skipped everything before her teenage years. As if her childhood had sprung from nowhere. As if the sleepless nights, the double shifts, the quiet embraces in the dark had belonged to someone invisible. Those weren't just photos. They were evidence. Evidence that I had been removed with surgical precision from the family narrative, and that no one there seemed to see a problem with it. The caption, "Just Family," was the final blow. 3 words that sealed a cycle of denial. Because it wasn't just a phrase in English. It was a message. A clear boundary between who belonged and who didn't. And me? I was clearly on the outside. Not because I had done something wrong, but because I no longer fit into the script of perfection they wanted to present. The kind of mother who didn't match the aesthetic of a curated feed. The one who didn't speak English. The one who didn't look good at the Scandinavian wooden table rented for the photos. That day, I realized my simple ways, my direct words, my gestures of affection, all of it had been deleted from the script. Erased with elegance. Social media amplifies the cruelty of family exclusion, the curation of affection. Every click decides who belongs and who doesn't. And when you're not chosen, you're not remembered. It doesn't matter how much you've given. It doesn't matter how much you've sacrificed. If you don't fit the aesthetic, you don't deserve a place. That's what I lived through. A silent trial where I was convicted without defense. Where the verdict was crystal clear: your presence ruins the image. And as much as that revealed about them, in that moment, it still felt like it was my fault. I tried to find an explanation that would make sense. Maybe they really had forgotten. Maybe I had misunderstood. But repeated absence is its own language. And they spoke it loud and clear. They spoke with photos. With hashtags. With silence. The worst kind of language is silence wrapped in smiles. Because it confuses you. It hurts. It makes you doubt your own perception. But that caption gave me clarity. It showed me the doubt was useless. That sometimes, the only way to regain your dignity is to face the truth, naked and raw. The cruelty of family exclusion is that it doesn't arrive with a blow. It comes delicately. With filters. With pastel tones. It comes dressed as something natural, even beautiful. And that's when you start questioning if maybe you're being too dramatic. But no. There is nothing natural about being erased from your own story. About looking at photos that should show your smile, your arms, your care, and seeing only smiles that walk right over you. As if you had never existed. As if it had all happened without you. The most painful proof of exclusion is when it's staged with picture-perfect affection. That's the moment when many women break. When many give up. Because it isn't easy to see, in high definition, the image of your own erasure. And yet, I looked. I analyzed every photo. And instead of shrinking, I awakened. Just family stopped being a symbol of pain and became a symbol of change. Because if they erased me from their narrative, I still had the power to write my own. I could still choose who would appear in my album. I could still create new memories with people who actually see me. What began as a punch to the gut turned into momentum. To step out of the footnotes. And finally become the author of my own story. From that moment on, I stopped justifying the unjustifiable. Because love that needs to be hidden, denied, disguised is not love. It's protocol. And I wasn't born to follow protocols. I was born to live with presence, with voice, with truth. The wedding exclusion was a milestone, yes, but not the end. It was only the mirror I needed to see the extent of my erasure. And that reflection gave me the courage for what would come next: closing accounts, rewriting my will, reclaiming my name. Because if just family cut me out of their lives, it was time to place myself back at the center of my own. With strength. With firmness. And with faith. Some people think invisibility happens all at once. But it doesn't. It builds slowly. A cutting comment here, a glance that doesn't meet yours, a well-talk later that never comes. The inventory of invisibility begins small, almost imperceptible. That's why it's so dangerous. You don't realize when you start to fade. You don't notice when you stop being a priority and become just a function. The mother who provides. The grandmother who takes care. The woman who sustains. And your own name slips further and further behind, buried under unacknowledged obligations. What's left are emotional crumbs and a deafening silence. In my house, invisibility smelled like coffee brewed too early and food going cold on the table. It looked like everyone eating while no one asked if I had eaten. It was me buying gifts but receiving none. Remembering birthdays, while mine passed unmentioned. Small things, yes, but constant. And that's the cruelty. It's not the absence of grand gestures. It's the absence of the small ones that builds erasure. The "Mom, I'm in a hurry" repeated every day. The "I'll get to it later" that never becomes now. That's how you begin to disappear, first from the routine, then from memory. The forgetfulness became routine. Gratitude turned into a rarity. What once was the exception became the rule. You grow used to being the last to know, to hearing news from other people's mouths, to being mentioned in the past, but never in the present. And suddenly, it hits you, it's not that people treat you badly, it's that they simply don't treat you at all. You become background. Like the furniture in the living room. Always there, but invisible. Essential, yet ignored. And that is the sharpest pain of all, being alive, yet treated as if you were already gone. I spent years collecting silent evidence. Like someone stuffing old bills into a worn envelope. The promise that they'd come pick me up, but never did. The family lunch where everyone showed up except me. The Christmas photo where my presence was cropped out, or worse, never even remembered. And with every new omission, a part of me retreated. I laughed it off, disguised it, repeated it's fine. But it wasn't fine. I just didn't want to be the burden. I didn't want to be the one begging for love. Because I had been raised to believe that loving meant serving. That being seen was a privilege, not a right. Do you know what's saddest of all? Even invisible, I kept trying. I kept cooking, helping, giving. Because I truly believed that if I just did enough, one day they would look at me again. But they didn't. Because people who grow accustomed to your emotional absence stop noticing when you're gone. Love, when it isn't reciprocated, becomes obligation. Obligation becomes invisibility. And invisibility turns into chronic pain. A pain that doesn't scream, but whispers every single day, you don't matter that much. And yet, you keep going. Because that's how we were taught to be women. It was only when I finally sat down to write everything out that I realized how much I had been erased in life. I created my own inventory, line by line, situation by situation. And there, I finally understood it wasn't exaggeration. It was proof. I had been forgotten too often for it to be accidental. Ignored too deliberately for it to be coincidence. I had given in every stage of life and been silenced in every stage too. They only looked for me when something was missing: money, time, comfort. But when it came to celebrating, sharing victories, or simply talking, I was never invited. Even the family group chat excluded me with those two words, just family. Invisibility has 1,000 faces. It can come disguised as "I'll call you later." That never happens. As "I didn't invite you because I thought you wouldn't want to come." Or even as "But you already have everything, Mom." Everything what? A forgotten name? A rationed affection? An existence tolerated but never celebrated? I made it a point to list every single detail. Not out of revenge. But because I needed to see, with my own eyes, what I had been hiding from myself for so long. And with that inventory in my hands, I understood it wasn't madness. It was a pattern. And patterns can be broken if you have the courage to face the emptiness and choose to step out of it. That's how my process of reclaiming began. Not reclaiming anyone else. Reclaiming myself. I started by cutting off the things that erased me. I started by saying no to requests that drained me. I began answering with silence to those who only saw me as a utility. Because invisibility only ends when you decide to see yourself and value yourself enough not to accept less than respect. That inventory became the beginning. The first page of a new chapter. What came after would demand even more courage. But at that moment, I had already taken the hardest step, admitting that I was disappearing. And that it needed to change. One day, I sat down with paper, pen, and a calculator. It wasn't out of spite, it was out of clarity. I wanted to know how much it had cost to love without return. How much I gave, how much I gave up, how much I pulled from myself to feed an emotional system that only worked as long as I was paying for everything. And that's how the dossier began. Rent I paid for years, groceries I bought on credit and was never reimbursed for, My own bills left unpaid so theirs would be covered. I didn't do this once or twice. I did it for decades. Out of instinct, out of habit, out of love. But love that demands you sink so the other can float is not love. It's imbalance. The first sheet summed up the monthly expenses I had covered since my daughter moved out. Help with my granddaughter's school fees. Loans I took out in my name. Expensive gifts I bought that were never even used. Then came the extras, the emergencies that always landed on my lap. And no, I'm not talking about luxuries. I'm talking about medication, diapers, electricity bills. Basic things, yes, but ones I carried alone. Because every time someone said, just until I get back on my feet, I believed them. Except that stability never came. And I grew old carrying the weight of a family that only remembered me when they needed something. The second sheet was even more painful. It was the emotional side of the account. How many parties where I was the cook but not the guest? How many times was I the babysitter when I just wanted to be the grandmother? How many times did I trade my rest for a favor? I lost trips, friendships, moments with myself. Every mom, can you help just one more time, shelved another piece of me. I said yes because I was afraid of losing the fragile connection they still offered me. Because when affection is scarce, even crumbs feel like a feast. But that day, I decided to stop eating off the floor. I wanted to know how much is love worth when it only works if it's bought? By the third sheet, the number was high. Much higher than I expected. And if it had been just about money, it would have hurt less. But along with the money came time, energy, silence. Because in exchange for all that, what I received was absence. A thanks without eye contact. A you've already done your part. As if affection had an expiration date. As if, because I was a mother, my work had already been paid off. But no one pays that debt. Because it isn't even acknowledged. It's normalized. The financial dossier of invisible motherhood never reaches a courtroom, but it should. Because there are silent crimes that steal far more than any theft ever could. I decided to keep that dossier. Not to charge anyone. But to remember. To remember who I had been, what I had done, and how much I had given. Because when we forget ourselves, we start accepting anything. Memory is our protection. And mine had been clouded by guilt. Guilt for wanting something in return. Guilt for believing I deserved something back. But holding that pile of papers in my hands, I finally understood there is nothing wrong with wanting to be loved fairly. It isn't petty to expect gratitude. It's human. And it isn't wrong to keep track. What's wrong is to love until the very last cent and still be called dramatic when you ask for the smallest gesture in return. After that, I changed the way I see love. Love is not an emotional bill. Love is not a contract signed by only one side. Love is not a constant sacrifice demanded from just one heart. I began to pay attention to those who loved me actively without depending on what I could give, pay, or fix. And I began to step back from those who only showed up when there was a crisis. Because in the end, real affection appears when there is nothing to offer except presence. And that, strangely enough, was the one thing most absent from my life: true presence. Love without conditions. Without function. Without servitude. There's a phrase I once read that never left me: love is free, but it's not without cost. I understood that late. But I did understand. To love means to give and receive. It demands truth. It requires that the other person is also willing to offer something back, even if it's just respect. When that doesn't happen, what we have is an unfair transaction. A kind of emotional loan with no due date. But now, looking back, I see that all those records, all those notes I kept, were not useless. They gave me clarity. They gave me purpose. They gave me the push I needed. And above all, they gave me the right to stop. To close that account. And to begin another story. In the end, I kept that envelope with care. Not as a bitter reminder, but as a memorial of who I had been. Because I was great. I was strong. I was present. I was the foundation. And for that alone, I deserved more. Not out of vanity, but out of justice. From that day forward, my relationship with love changed. I no longer gave blindly. I no longer gave out of obligation. Because love without steady return turns into emotional debt, and I chose to live without a negative balance in my soul. What came after was more painful, but also more liberating. Because facing the real balance sheet of a life given away is the very first step toward finally living for yourself. There was no scream, no fight, no dramatic crisis. The awakening didn't make noise. It was internal. Silent, like a sigh carrying decades of weight. It came while I was washing the dishes, days after seeing those wedding photos. The water was running, the soap sliding, and I was there on autopilot, as always. But suddenly the question came, raw and sharp: why? Why keep replying to empty messages? Why keep accepting to be called only when needed? Why keep alive a bond where I was the only one giving real affection? The answer didn't come in words. It came as a decision. From that moment, I chose not to answer emptiness anymore. Not to feed crumbs. It was a timid beginning. So quiet that even I barely noticed it. I stopped sending good morning texts. I stopped asking how they were doing. I muted the family groups where I was only included out of formality. I didn't delete anyone that would have caused too much noise. But I withdrew emotionally. And here's the curious part: when you stop chasing after people, the echo of silence reveals everything. Nobody missed me. Nobody called. Nobody showed up. And in the middle of that nothing, I realized that my effort had always been one-sided. Their absence wasn't a reaction. It was routine. I just hadn't wanted to see it. And when I finally stopped pretending, I saw clearly one-sided love is a theater that drains the soul. That awakening wasn't anger. It was grief. Because there is pain in stopping. There is loss in giving up on a bond you wished so deeply to keep alive. But there is also freedom. The freedom of no longer running after people who had always been running away from me. I began to write my own name with more strength. I signed documents without trembling. I introduced myself without saying, "I'm so-and-so's mother." Because yes, I am a mother. But I am much more. And for years, I erased everything that came before mother. As if my entire identity had been reduced to caregiving. As if my love for others was enough to define me. It wasn't. Reclaiming your own name is harder than it sounds. Because it carries memories, versions of yourself you left behind. But it's also an act of courage. To say, "I don't want to live like this anymore," is to face loneliness, fear, guilt. But it's also to open the door to something new. Something whole. I started with small things. I read a book I'd wanted to for years. I went to the movies alone. I cooked again for myself, not for others. And in each gesture, I rediscovered that there was life beyond the function. That my story was still being written even if others had erased me from their pages. And there's a peace that only comes when you stop begging for attention. The moment you realize you can exist without someone else's approval. That you don't need to justify living your own way. That you can and must prioritize yourself. The choice to stop answering empty messages wasn't indifference. It was dignity. I no longer wanted to take part in conversations where I was the only one speaking with real affection. Where "Hi, Mom" was just code for a request. Where "I was thinking of you" meant "I need something." From that awakening forward, I chose my peace. And I never gave it up again. Autonomy doesn't begin when you shout. It begins when you choose the right silence. A silence that isn't absence, it's a choice. A silence that isn't coldness, it's self-care. And that changes everything. Because for the very first time, I stopped trying to prove myself. I stopped trying to be useful, necessary, indispensable. And I simply started to be. Just that, to be. To be a woman. To be an individual. To be someone who deserves love without having to pay for it with constant sacrifice. And that led me to a new place, standing before the mirror and actually liking what I saw. Even with wrinkles. Even with the years etched on my face. Because the woman looking back at me had chosen dignity. It was in this spirit of rediscovery that I decided to review my priorities. I looked at my bank account with different eyes. Not as a reservoir to help everyone else, but as a tool to finally help myself. I planned better days, even without knowing if they would come. I allowed myself to dream of a new beginning, even if late. Because if life is short, it can also be fair. And fairness, for me, meant no longer pouring myself out where it was never valued. It meant cutting the cycles that drained me. It meant turning off the pipelines that bled me dry. That led me to the next step. Something that looked simple but felt monumental: reorganizing my payments. And then the idea came: if love had been a badly managed account, maybe it was time to close a few debts. My inner awakening had prepared me for this. It gave me strength to shut off the taps that only leaked exhaustion. But this part demanded more than decision. It demanded action. And action has consequences. Family ones. Emotional ones. But I was ready. Because once you listen to that inner crack, the one that doesn't scream but leaves a scar inside, there's no turning back. It's like waking from a dream. A dream where you were just a supporting role. And now, you want to be the protagonist. On the banking app, each automatic transfer was a living reminder of who I had been for far too long: the silent provider. It didn't matter the phase, the crisis, the excuse. Every month, the amounts went out right on time. And they never came back as thank you. They never returned as visits, care, or affection. That wasn't help anymore. That was maintaining a system where I financed everyone else's comfort at the expense of my own. The cut began there. With a click. With a gesture that might look small to anyone else, but to me, it was enormous. I cancelled the first payment with a trembling hand. The second, with steadiness. The third, with relief. I didn't cut everything. I kept two things: the monthly donation to a nonprofit I loved, and the fund I had set aside for Lily, my granddaughter. Because she, yes, had never forgotten me. She called without asking for anything. She sent notes, drawings, photos. She loved me without demands, without usefulness. And that is priceless. The rest? I cut. One by one. No announcements. No drama. Because those who never said thank you don't deserve an explanation. It didn't take long before they noticed. My phone, which had been silent for days, started to buzz again. Mom, did the transfer go through? Was there a bank problem? Are you okay? Were they worried? No. They were missing the money. That's all. And the irony? That was the moment I felt most alive. Because for the first time, I realized I had power over my money, and over my energy. The financial cut was symbolic. I was saying, without words, that I would no longer trade love for automatic debits. That from now on, my account, both financial and emotional, would be protected. And that was revolutionary. I allowed myself to use my money for me. For the little things I enjoyed. An online embroidery class. A weekend at a small, quiet inn. A fancy coffee with lemon cake. Small things, yes. But each one whispered you matter. The phone calls came next. Emails too. WhatsApp messages dripping with concern. But I could read between the lines. What hurt them wasn't my absence, it was the missing funds. And cruel as that may be, it was also liberating. Because it confirmed what I had felt all along: I was valuable only as long as I functioned. As long as I served. And real love? That revealed itself in the silences. Those who reached out just to ask how I was, without money involved, I kept them in my heart. Those who vanished or demanded explanations, I filed them away in memory. As part of a cycle now closing. And that's not ingratitude. That's emotional justice. The bank taught me more about relationships than any therapist ever could. Because money doesn't lie. It reveals priorities. Intentions. affections. And my statements were screaming, "You are giving too much to people who don't care." So I decided to stop. Not out of rage, but with clarity. It was like turning off a faucet that had dripped endlessly. The silence that followed was strange at first. But little by little, it became peace. A peace I hadn't felt in years. Because living to keep everyone else comfortable while erasing yourself is a prison. And I was finally breaking free. I began drafting a new financial plan. Simple, objective, designed just for me. I included small trips, books, medical checkups I had postponed for years. I opened a savings account in my name alone, where I deposited what once went to them. And with that, I rebuilt something I had lost long ago: autonomy. Having money is having the power of choice. And for the first time in a very long while, I was choosing for myself. Choosing not to be the emergency fund of other people's crises. Not to be the vault of their emotional needs. Not to be the ATM for those who never wanted to split the real costs of life. The account of love, now, was balanced and in the positive. Of course, the accusations came. "You've become selfish. Now you're counting pennies?" Don't say I didn't warn you later. I listened in silence. Because those who always profited from your generosity will call any sign of limit selfishness. But I knew exactly what I was doing. For the first time, my bank account and my emotional account were aligned. Both protected. Both managed with consciousness. And even if the world screamed otherwise, I knew this wasn't selfishness. It was self-respect. It was dignity restored. And if the price of that was being misunderstood, then I would pay it gladly. That cut was more than financial. It was emotional. It was symbolic. It was the moment I stopped begging for recognition and started building respect. Because respect doesn't come from those who get everything for free. It comes from those who see you as whole. From that point on, the truth became crystal clear who loved me, and who only loved what I provided. And that distinction, as painful as it was, became the foundation of the next step. A deeper one. One that had nothing to do with money but with legacy. Because cutting off the flow was necessary. But what I would do with what remained, that would change everything. It happened on a stifling Sunday afternoon when the doorbell rang. I already knew they would come. The cuts I had made over the past weeks had caused ripples. They weren't coming out of affection, they were coming out of discomfort. The collapse of their support system unsettled them more than my absence ever did. I opened the gate slowly, sat on the porch, and waited. Rachel arrived first, nervous, phone in hand, with a rehearsed speech ready. "Are you okay?" she asked, trying to sound casual. I smiled, unhurried. "I'm great. And you, do you need something?" The question turned into a mirror. She didn't know how to answer. For the first time, the dynamic had shifted. And she felt it. The porch had always been a stage for hard conversations. But this time was different. I was whole. I was calm. I didn't need to yell or justify myself. Rachel spoke of missing me, of surprise at my withdrawal, of how the family was concerned about my distance. I let her speak. Because when someone is used to your obedience, any sign of autonomy feels like a threat. And then, with firmness, I answered. I haven't pulled away. I just stopped giving where there was no return. Silence. Immediate. She blinked, unsettled. She had never seen me like this. Because I had never allowed myself to be seen like this. But that day was not about her. It was about me. I explained, without drama, what had changed. I told her about the cuts. About the awakening. About the record I had kept. I said that loving could not mean erasing myself. That helping was not the same as servitude. And that being a mother did not make me a charity institution. She tried to argue. But you always insisted. I interrupted, gently but firmly. Insisting doesn't mean I'm available forever. It means I loved you. But now, I also love myself. The words hung in the air like a contained storm. For the first time, my love came with boundaries, with structure, with a voice. And that disarmed her. Because when you impose yourself with dignity, there's no room left for manipulation. The most curious part? I wasn't nervous. Not one bit. Because when you finally find yourself, the fear of confrontation disappears. It gives way to certainty. If you lose a relationship for the sake of your truth, maybe it was never a real relationship to begin with. On that porch, I made it clear I didn't want to break ties, but I would not return to the place of servitude. She breathed deeply, looked around, and said, "You've changed." I replied, without hesitation. Finally. Because for decades, being the same had meant accepting scraps. And I no longer wanted to be that woman. I wanted to be seen. I wanted to be respected. I wanted to be remembered even when there were no favors at stake. Rachel tried to negotiate. "We can go back to how it was before with balance." And calmly I explained, "I will not return to a before where I was a ghost. I'll only accept a now where I am a person." There was no bitterness in my voice, but also no space for returning to the past. The confrontation on the porch was clean. No shouting. No scandal. Just the clear statement of the new rules of the game. And this time, I was the one who set them. Because love without respect cannot stand. And I was no longer willing to trade my peace for false reconciliations. If she wanted to come back into my life, it would be to walk beside me, not on top of me. She cried. Tried to explain. Said she hadn't realized, that she was overwhelmed, that she thought that's just how it was. I listened. But I didn't feed her guilt. Because that was no longer my role. I wasn't there to heal anyone. I was there to keep myself whole. And that required not letting someone else's guilt erase my pain. So I said, "You may have taken time to notice, but now that you see it, you have only two choices: repeat it, or change it." As simple as that. And though hard, it was liberating. Because the responsibility for change was not mine alone. It belonged to those who had contributed to the hurt. And they needed to own that. After the confrontation, the silence was different. Not uncomfortable. Necessary. Rachel stood, hugged me, and for the first time, without asking for anything. It felt strange. But real. A hug without function. Without emotional blackmail. Just presence. I didn't cry. Because it wasn't an ending. It was a possible new beginning. A moment of re-evaluation. And if something new grew from that, it would be by mutual choice. Not obligation. The confrontation didn't burn the bridge. But it made clear that if she wanted to reach me, she'd have to walk too. Because this time, I wasn't crossing alone. And I wasn't carrying anyone on my back. That night, I sat on the same porch. Alone. I watched the sky change colors. I felt the air grow lighter. And I understood this wasn't about winning or losing. It was about standing my ground. What came after would still be uncertain. But I had already done what was necessary. I looked inside myself and I chose me. And that changes everything. Because after years of being a supporting character, I was finally at the center of my own story. And there, in the silence of that warm night, I realized love without servitude is possible. But it begins with the courage to confront those you love. So that maybe, just maybe, a new kind of love, a fairer one, can be born from it. Rewriting my will felt like rewriting my story. For the first time, I put on paper who had truly stood by my side, not who simply expected to receive. Most of it, I left to Lily. Not out of obligation, but out of merit. I created a trust, protected from interference, so that nothing and no one could take from her what had been built with love. To the others, I left what was fair. Not what they expected, but what they deserved. A firm gesture, not a bitter one. A reckoning with the past, and with my own conscience. I left letters alongside the documents. Truths handwritten. Not sugar-coated, but not poisoned either. It was time to record who I was, not who they wanted me to be. Inside each envelope, A piece of myself returned to me. And in that practical act, I did something symbolic. I placed my story at the center. Because a life lived in the shadows must, one day, sign its own existence in bold ink. With no room for doubt. My legacy now had a name, a face, a direction. It wasn't just inheritance, it was positioning. I didn't leave only assets. I left a message. That love cannot come with a clause of silence. That no woman should die without being seen. And that once we choose to protect ourselves, the world learns it can no longer erase us. Lily never asked me for anything, yet somehow, she gave me everything. Her little notes filled with hearts, her lopsided muffins, her comforting silences. In the middle of a collapsing family, she was what remained pure. She didn't come out of habit. She came out of affection. And through her, I relearned that real love is presence without demand. With her, I was a grandmother, not a servant. A person, not a function. And that gave me back entire pieces of myself. We created our own rituals, afternoons of letters, books, recipes, confidences. She once gave me a bracelet with the word voice carved on it and said it was to remind me mine was her favorite. I never forgot. Because in that childish gesture lived an ancient wisdom: the ones who see you when no one else does, those are the bonds that matter. Those are the roots. And it's for that kind of love that it's worth blooming again. Lily was the thread that held my world together. Not with demands, but with simple affection. She didn't just inherit part of my estate, she inherited my name in its truest sense, knowing that you can be a woman, a mother, a grandmother without ever stopping being yourself. Rachel came back without a rehearsed excuse. She sat on the couch and said, her voice trembling, "Mom, forgive me. I erased you." For the first time, she hadn't come asking for help, she came offering remorse. And I could see it was real. But forgiveness isn't forgetfulness. It's the negotiation of a new beginning. So I told her, if it's to be like before, it won't work. But if it's to build something new, the door is open. She stayed. For the first time, she stayed without asking. Slowly, we began to clear the path. She listened more than she spoke. She asked more than she demanded. She started watering the plant Lily had given us, our new spring, as she called it. It was symbolic. But it was also healing. Rachel was trying. And this time, without hurry, without guilt disguised as affection. She was starting from zero. And that was the only way it could work. Forgiveness came, but it came with a clause: respect. I made it clear I would never go back to being a shadow. She understood. Because now she knew who I was. Not just the mother, but the whole woman behind motherhood. And that late recognition, even late, it was worth it. I planted my spring with my hands, but also with my choices. Flowers in the yard. Firmness in my eyes. Dignity in my voice. Not to prove anything to anyone, but to never forget myself again. Because after years of erasure, I chose to see myself. To care for myself. To protect myself. And anyone who wants to walk with me now must see me too. With name. With story. With worth. My manifesto is not shouted. It is lived. It is in every no I say without guilt. In every yes I give because I truly want to. It is in the moment I stopped waiting and started choosing. It is in knowing that visibility is not luxury, it is justice. Because no woman was born to be the footnote of any family. And if they try to erase me for so long, now I write in bold. Out loud. With wide margins. May my story serve as a reminder: no one is born to live forgotten. And if you, reading this, feel something burning inside you, know this: there is still time. Time to bloom. Time to cut. Time to begin again. Because visibility is the beautiful name we give when we finally learn to exist fully. You may have lived years being useful, but never recognized. You may have given everything, absolutely everything, secretly hoping to be seen. Maybe you mistook silence for peace. Maybe you called crumbs love. Maybe you accepted a life where your story was just the backdrop for someone else's narrative. But if something inside you stirred while reading this journey, it's because the fire is still there. There is still presence. There is still time. The truth is, it doesn't matter your age, your role, your past. What matters is the moment you decide enough. The instant you stand up from the bench where they left you waiting. The second you stop chasing after those who only know how to use you as a ladder. That instant, silent, solitary, but absolutely transforming, is the beginning of your visibility. Not the kind others hand you, but the kind you finally allow yourself to claim. This story is about one woman, but it could be about many. About mothers, grandmothers, daughters, women who never had the chance to simply be themselves. Who were reduced to roles. Who were erased with smiles and subtle cuts. Who were emotionally abandoned by the very people they called family. And yet, they still love. Still hope. Still believe. But loving is not abandoning yourself. And forgiving is not submitting. Real love begins the moment you look in the mirror and recognize yourself. As a whole story. As a legacy. As a presence. And if this story spoke to you, do something right now. Subscribe to the channel and comment below, "I am the whole story." This phrase is not just a statement. It is a turning point. The beginning of another narrative, yours. Let's create a chain of women who chose to see themselves, hear themselves, and take their place. Who no longer accept being the footnote. Who refuse to live in halves. Because silence may have been imposed, but voice is a choice. And yours, now, can be the echo that awakens others.